things unique to the state of Pennsylvania. Today's episode is about Valley Forge. Located about 25 miles northwest of Philadelphia, Valley Forge National Historic Park is often considered the birthplace of America's Army. By December of 1777, the Continental Army had seen a series of defeats during the Philadelphia campaign at Brandywine Creek and Germantown, which saw the British firmly in control of the Colonial Capitol. The Commander-in-Chief, General George Washington, began looking for a place to set up the Army's winter encampment that would still enable them to keep an eye on the British and protect the Pennsylvania countryside. He selected a high plateau along the Schuylkill River, about 25 miles from Philadelphia, where a town by the name of Valley Forge had recently been used as a supply cache after the defeat at Brandywine. The area around Valley Forge made for an excellent defensive position. The Schuylkill River protected their flank, and two smaller streams would make cavalry assaults difficult and hinder artillery movement, while the high ground itself meant that any attack would have to be fought uphill. On December 12th, the Continental Army would begin their march into Valley Forge, and almost immediately, problems arose. Poor winter weather had made some of the roads and bridges impassable. This, coupling with organizational delays, made the 13-mile march take 8 days to complete. And even upon arrival, there was no warm welcome waiting for them at Valley Forge. The British had learned of the supplies a few months earlier and had raided the town, taking the goods and burning the buildings. When the Continental Army arrived, all that greeted them was a few farmers and trees. With winter setting in, the first priority was to build adequate shelters, getting the troops out of their tents and into something warmer. To do this, they used what they could find, trees, felling nearly every tree in the valley and using the logs to build huts roughly 14 by 16 feet with a small fireplace at one end. These huts were damp, drafty, and generally unhealthy, with about 12 men sharing and often sleeping on the dirt floor. But they did work. Over the course of the time that they were here, over 1,200 of these huts would have been constructed. The real problem would start with the supply chain. Part of the reason Valley Forge was chosen was the Schuylkill River and fairly well-established roads in the area. The intention was to allow easier supply routes from the Pennsylvania countryside. But during the winter, this was not to be. Ice and freezing temperatures made boats on the river difficult at best, while the weather and increased traffic from the Army itself made the roads a rutted mess. And when you add in a quartermaster who largely ignored the job, you end up with meager rations and ill-equipped soldiers, many of them without even shoes. Even Washington himself would remark at the state of the Army, and in a letter they had written to the Convention of New Hampshire asking for aid, he would state that we had in camp not less than 2,898 men unfit for duty, by reason of their being barefoot or otherwise naked. Besides this number, sufficiently distressing of itself, there are many others detained in hospitals and crowded in farmers' houses for the same causes. While the supply issues themselves were a potentially deadly problem, what they led to was far worse. The men's meager rations and inability to escape the harshness of winter had left them susceptible to dysentery and typhus. The damp and crowded huts saw the sickness pass through the camp with relative ease. Poor hygiene and sanitary practices made things even worse for the Army, with many men relieving themselves closer to their huts rather than trudge through the winter cold to the proper latrines. It is estimated that as many as 3,000 men died of illness through that encampment. All of this had culminated to a point where morale and military discipline was at an all-time low. This was all brought to an end in late February with the arrival of a Prussian drill master with a very long name, but is commonly referred to as Baron von Steuben. Baron Friedrich von Steuben had been hired to help the American cause. Upon arrival, he was asked to inspect the state of the Army and give a report of his findings. This report was unfavorable at best. In addition to the issues and squalor previously mentioned, he noticed the troops had very little of the skills needed to fight in those days. With multiple different officers teaching from multiple different drill manuals, uniformity was non-existent. Von Steuben was immediately appointed Inspector General and began a series of rigorous training designed specifically for the American situation. Simplicity was key. Marching in ranks, maneuvering, and the use of bayonets were constantly drilled, with von Steuben himself demonstrating each movement. Through his gruff manner and curses in broken English, Baron Friedrich von Steuben would transform the American army in a matter of weeks, and the troops began showing a notable proficiency and pride that had previously been unknown. But these were not the only changes made at the end of winter. To combat the spreading illness, Washington began recommending that all new recruits receive smallpox inoculations prior to their arrival in camp, and instituted a strict punishment of 5 lashes to any man caught not using the proper latrines. March would also see him appointing a new quartermaster general, the ever-capable Nathaniel Greene, who almost immediately dispatched engineers to fix the bridges and roads in the area, hoping that it would improve supplies, which it did, soon after yielding results as the goods flowed decently into camp. The icing on the cake came with the French entry into the war in April. The boost to morale at every level of the army was significant, and the French supplies and uniforms even more so. But beyond that, the British occupying Philadelphia had perceived their position in the city as untenable, believing that the French Navy could blockade the Delaware Bay, cutting them off from supply, leaving them besieged and trapped. In order to prevent this, they evacuated the city on June 18th to consolidate their forces in New York City instead. When Washington learned of this, he immediately broke camp and pursued. 10 days later, the two armies would clash in New Jersey at Monmouth Courthouse. While the battle itself was relatively inconclusive, it was the British who withdrew, making it clear to all that the mob of soldiers that had gone into Valley Forge had come out as a unified army, capable of standing up to the might of the British Empire. First preserved in 1893, Valley Forge was initially established as the first state park of Pennsylvania. It would later be given as a gift to the United States at the nation's bicentennial anniversary in 1976, and added to the National Park Service, who maintain and operate it to this day. The Visitor Center welcomes the park's more than 1.5 million annual visitors, with a detailed museum outlining the events of Valley Forge and the impact it had on the American Revolution. A brief video and interactive displays help to educate the masses in a fun and memorable way, while more than 26 miles of trails work their way through the park as monuments and memorials pay homage to the men and women who struggled through that winter. Reenactments and historic recreations bring history to life, allowing guests to experience a closer look at the stories of the Continental Army. Stories of how perseverance and selfless dedication can overcome seemingly impossible circumstances. Stories that are best learned here, at one of the many events held throughout the year, or better yet, through the field trip opportunities that are offered through the National Park Service itself, which I will include links to below. And with Valley Forge resting at about 30 minutes from either Philadelphia or Downingtown, and public transportation directly to the park itself, a visit to Valley Forge has never been easier for anybody with a free day in Philadelphia and a curiosity for the impossible circumstances that led to the birth of the United States. That's going to wrap it up for today's episode. Thank you guys so much for watching. As per the usual, if you have any suggestions on where you'd like to see me go next, feel free to leave them in the comments below. In the meantime, hit that like and subscribe so that you can receive updates on about anything else near Valley Forge or all across the state of Pennsylvania itself. But in the meantime, y'all have a good one.